Consider the camera. Almost everyone has one now. You probably have one on your person most of the time. Pictures have become a part of our everyday life and are something that we share with the world regularly over various social media platforms. Most cell phone cameras operate in a perpetual auto settings mode, but do you know how this amazing piece of technology actually works? Have you ever wondered why professional photographers' photos look completely different than regular snapshots? Although equipment is important, technical knowledge is much more vital in creating beautiful images. Although there are many settings that affect the quality of your photograph, there are three main settings that make the biggest difference of it all. There are many factors that affect the outcome of your images. The biggest factor is being able to create beautiful images comes from knowing how to shoot in manual mode. Aperture, also called f-stop, refers to how far open or closed your lens is and affects your focus. Aperture defined is a space through which light passes in an optical or photographic instrument, especially the variable open by which light enters a camera. The lower the number on your aperture setting, the smaller amount of your photo that is in focus. This creates a blurred black background effect called bokeh. The higher your number is, it means that more of your photograph is in focus. Typically, your aperture should be set per number of people in the shot. Typically, a single person can be shot around 1.8 or 2, whereas two people you'd want to shoot your aperture with your aperture set to at least 2.2, 2.4, so on and so forth. Aperture affects light. The lower the number, the wider the lens is open and the more light that is let in at any given time. Aperture capabilities are determined by your lenses. Cheaper lenses have a smaller aperture range, whereas a more expensive lens typically would have a wider range with a ability to have a much shallower range of focus, which is preferable in professional setting. The second setting we're going to be exploring is called shutter speed. Shutter speed determines the length of time that your shutter remains open. It is defined as the length of time when the film or digital sensor inside the camera is exposed to light. Typically, the lowest you would ever want to set your shutter speed is about 1/125th of a second for portraits. When shooting children, you shoot at a much higher speed, closer to at least 250, typically at least 325. The higher the shutter speed, the less motion blur that you capture. Shutter speed also affects how much light your lens takes in. The lower the bottom number, the slower the shutter speed, and the more light that is let into your lens. I actually had a situation today where it was so incredibly bright while I was shooting that I had to increase my shutter speed to what I refer to as hummingbird speeds, where I had it at about, I think it was 4,000, so 1/4000th of a second, in order to let in the smallest amount of light possible in order to keep things from being overexposed. The last setting I'm going to be touching on is called the ISO. Now, ISO deals directly with how much light your lens is actually seeking out at any given time. The definition of ISO would be that it measures the sensitivity of the image sensor. Generally speaking, the lower the ISO, the better when it comes to the quality of your photographs. A lower ISO means your lens is seeking out less light, and therefore your photos are much more crisp and less grainy. You're not going to get a lot of background noise in the pictures. A higher ISO means that your lens is seeking out more light and can tend to make your pictures extremely grainy, especially in low light situations where your camera is trying to pull in any light it can find and make the picture visible. If you're doing that, then you're going to have a lot of grainy distortion. Typically, the highest you'd ever need to set your ISO in a natural light would be about 400. You wouldn't typically need to go much higher than that unless you're in a very shady situation. In low light situations, such as shooting indoors with no natural lighting or flash, you set your ISO up to about 800 before you start to get extremely noisy images. I actually was shooting last night for a homecoming party, and they were in a shady area in the evening time against a brick wall, and I actually had to increase my ISO to bring in enough light, but it caused the photos to end up being somewhat grainy, which can be fixed in post-processing, but it's a lot of extra work, and it doesn't lend to as nice of a picture as what you would get if your settings were correct from the beginning. When these three settings are used properly together, you will have a properly exposed photograph every time. Now, you typically will need test shots in between when you're changing locations and the lighting changes. If the sun goes behind a cloud, things are going to change, so you're constantly changing your settings as you go. Although there is nothing wrong with snapshots, if you have a camera that has the ability to have the settings changed manually, it is worth learning how to control them. Although people tend to think that it's just the big, bulky DSLRs that have these options, a lot of your point-and-shoot little cameras, like the Coolpix kind of deal, those have the ability to be changed and set to a manual mode where you can actually control your ISO and your aperture and your shutter speed and really have your pictures look the way you want them to look, even without them being professional quality. And I'm going to leave you with a quote. To me, photography is an art of observation. It's about finding something interesting in an ordinary place. I found that has little to do with the things you see and everything to do with the way you see them. Thank you.